Yes.
Would you mind muting?
Judith is muted.
Hello and welcome. I'm Katrina Meller and will be facilitating the webinar today. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist and have been heavily involved in the Royal College of Psychiatrists' response to the climate and ecological emergency. Earlier this year, I was delighted to be invited to be a co-author on the study we'll talk about today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping points. This is a Zoom webinar, so your microphones are muted and you can't see other participants. The event is being recorded and will be freely available afterwards on the Avaz YouTube channel. We're hosted today by the Climate Psychology Alliance, thank you to them, and Judith Anderson and Rachel Webster are offering us technical support. So if you're experiencing problems, please use the chat box to reach out to them. There'll be 2 opportunities for questions from the audience. Please write questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and please indicate if you would like your name read out, and we won't do so unless you clearly specify. We have multiple speakers today, so it would help if you could indicate who your question's for. And please join the conversation on Twitter using #WeFeelThisToo. So, a warm welcome to this webinar, Climate Anxiety in Children and Young People, Academic Perspectives and Broader Social Implications. Our findings about climate anxiety in children and young people and their beliefs about government responses were released just over a month ago as a preprint in the Lancet Planetary Health, and with a launch event organised by Avaz. The findings have generated worldwide discussion. Climate anxiety is one way of describing what it feels like to be living at this time, and there are many other ways. We know this experience can be overwhelming for some, and that the climate crisis itself will exacerbate mental ill health. However, climate anxiety is not mental illness. It is a sign of being aware of the reality of the situation and is an understandable response to the threat we face. Since publishing the findings, there have been over 1,100 articles in the media. The results have been discussed at the highest political level, and of great importance to us, young people have reached out directly and said that this has helped them. We organised this webinar to continue this conversation. We want to help young people feel heard, validated and supported in their distress, and to stimulate deeper conversation about our role in this. The young people we speak to have been clear on the most appropriate response to our devastating findings: drastic, just climate action. We have 90 minutes and lots of people to hear from. The aim of tonight is to stimulate more conversation by sharing multiple perspectives. We hope that this will be the first of other such events. We've split today's event into 2 halves. The first half will cover these themes listed on the slide. We'll hear a summary of the study's findings from 2 co-authors. We'll hear from other researchers in the field and from our first guest speaker, Sally Weintraub, before having some time for questions. In the second half, we aim to cover these themes. We have 2 guest speakers. Catherine Langford will share her thoughts in conversation, and Branch Verley will offer her reflections. We will hear from our other co-authors, and there will again, hopefully, be time for some more questions before Caroline Hickman wraps up the evening with final comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. So it's time to move to our first 2 speakers who will summarise our study's findings. They are both co-authors of the study. Susan Clayton is a professor of social psychology at the College of Worcester in Ohio and a visiting fellow at the Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. Excuse my French accent. Her research focuses on the human relationship with the natural world and climate anxiety in particular. She is the author of a widely cited report on mental health and our changing climate, and is the lead author on the upcoming 6th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She will talk about the motivation for our study and its principal findings, and then we'll hand directly over to Dr. Panu Pikala, who is a leading multidisciplinary eco-anxiety researcher in the University of Helsinki and the author of several books on the topic in Finnish. He'll speak today particularly about the climate emotions element of the study. Over to you, Susan.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much, Katrina. I'm thrilled to be part of this webinar and to see such a diverse international audience. My goal today will be to very briefly give you some background on the study and describe some of the principal findings, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Piccola, who will go into some more of the details. So let me share my screen and show you some slides. So our goal of the study was to describe climate anxiety among young people. And you've just heard a description of what climate anxiety is. All of you here have no doubt been giving it some thought yourselves. Our goal is not so much to arrive at a precise definition of the term as to explore its occurrence and existence among young people around the world. And the reason we thought it was important to do that was that climate anxiety, it seems to be on the increase. You hear increasing reference to it in the media. We see increasing numbers of people talking to their therapists about climate anxiety or otherwise describing their experiences with it. One of the reasons climate anxiety is of such concern is that it can affect not just people who are directly impacted by climate change, but anyone who's aware of its existence, which ultimately, of course, will include everyone. And we also are concerned about the potential impacts of climate anxiety on mental health, although by itself, it's not a mental disorder. It's a source of stress and has been associated with anxiety and depression. So that's why we wanted to study it. The way we chose to do this was to really try and get a global survey as broadly inclusive as possible. And again, not to look at the finer details, but to get a big picture of whether young people were concerned about climate change, whether they believed that their concerns were affecting their ability to function, which would suggest to us that it had real significance for mental health, and then what some of their emotions and beliefs related to climate change were. So the survey, we surveyed 10,000 children and young people, 1,000 each from 10 different countries. And as you can see, we tried to get a wide range of countries. This was not a fully representative survey because it's an internet survey. You can't get a fully representative sample of the population, but it was not a survey of environmental activists. It was not biased towards people who were already thinking about climate change. It was as representative as an internet survey could be. And I want to point out that the survey was done in May and June of this year. And in July and August, we saw some pretty significant climate events that were linked to climate change, wildfires, heat waves, and so on. So it's quite possible that had the survey been done a few months later, the results would have been even more striking. But what we found was that over 80% of our respondents reported that they were worried about climate change. So that's kind of the base level finding. 80% are worried, and 45% said that their worries were affecting their daily functioning, their ability to eat, to concentrate, to play, to work, and so on. Not surprisingly, there was variability among the countries. You won't have time to look at all this in depth, but perhaps you can see that the countries that reported the greatest impact on functioning tend to be developing countries, whereas the countries that were at a higher level of technological development are perhaps a little bit more buffered from the effects of climate change. Nevertheless, it's important to note that in every country, there was a significant majority of people who are at least moderately worried about climate change. I think that's the biggest picture finding, is that everyone was worried. We asked them about their range of emotions, something you'll hear more about from our next speaker, but I just want to highlight that over 50% were reporting these negative 7 emotions that they felt in response to climate change, and less than a third felt either optimistic or indifferent. So we did give them those options and they were not reporting them. Large majorities endorsed statements such as people have failed to take care of the planet, the future is frightening. Over half endorsed the statement that humanity is doomed. They thought they wouldn't have access to the same opportunities their parents had, that the things they most value will be destroyed, and their family's security will be threatened. And 4 out of 10 said that they were hesitant to have children because of climate change. I don't want to imply that that means 4 out of 10 will not have children, but just that their concerns are so powerful that they're considering this really a fundamental decision in that light. I also want to stress that this climate concern is not just about the climate change, but it exists within the social context. So among those who said they tried to talk to other people about climate change, nearly half of them said they'd been dismissed or ignored. And some of our main findings, we asked them about how they perceived governmental response to the crisis. Large majorities described governments as failing young people, dismissing distress, betraying future generations. And large majorities also disagreed that the government can be trusted, takes our concerns seriously, is protecting the planet and the future generation. So I am out of time. I just want to close by saying, again, thank you. And that when we need to, when we start to think about understanding the sources of climate anxiety and ways to help people, especially young people, cope with climate anxiety, we need to recognize the fact that it exists within this social context. And now I'll pass it over to Dr. Piccola.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Helsinki. Very good to be here with you. As mentioned, I will focus on the affective dimension of our study. What does anxiety mean to you? The term anxiety is wide-ranging, and the same applies to so-called eco-anxiety. There are different manifestations of climate anxiety, which is the climate crisis-related part of eco-anxiety. Climate anxiety can feel terrible and lead even to self-destructive behavior. However, fundamentally, climate anxiety is a very rational reaction to the very real crises we are facing. In our study, we are applying the concept of practical anxiety developed by anxiety researcher and philosopher Charlie Kurtz, which describes this adaptive dimension. Anxiety arises when we encounter threats which include uncertainty. Then we start to search for more information. We usually become motivated to do something about the problems. And in that way, fundamentally, anxiety is very valuable. Emotions are not problems fundamentally, even though we are researching many problematic instances of these climate emotions in our research. Emotions can help us to react to what happens. There can be problematic instances when emotions do not serve us, when they become complicated. And adults need to support children and youth with climate emotions. And that requires adults to face their own emotions. Some observations about the emotion-related findings from the research article. 67% of the respondents self-recognized fear and 62% anxiety in relation to climate change. This shows that there is so much called eco-fear, meaning a very rational reaction again to the severity of the threats we are facing. So both fear and anxiety. 67% self-recognized sadness and 42% grief. This shows that the so-called climate grief is very prominent, but also that multiple words are needed to describe it. many people resonated with the word sadness to describe their feelings. 57% self-recognized anger, and this points to a crucial need to research more the various dynamics of so-called climate rage or eco-anger. There is a lot of moral outrage because of injustices, and that again is a very constructive part of so-called climate rage and eco-anger. 56% reported feeling powerless and 51% feeling helpless. And these issues are of course crucial also in relation to citizenship and democracy, because so many young people feel that they can't make an impact. These are also major components of eco-anxiety, because there is motivation to do something about the problems, and then if you feel powerless, then the threat becomes more uncontrollable, which increases intense forms of anxiety. 50% reported guilt and 46% feeling ashamed. Now, just on the basis of this research, we cannot know everything about the complex dynamics of so-called eco-guilt and environmental shame. Have the youth internalized eco-guilt and shame? Or are they mainly ashamed because of the lack of adult responses? What's the role of the collective dimension here? Based on other research, we know that all these kinds of environmental shame and climate guilt exist, but more research is needed. Anyway, these feelings are really challenging. Couple of words about the future. It's clear that the dynamics need to be studied more, and many emotions are tricky to research via online surveys. That is why psychosocial research is so important in relation to these issues. Still, the message emerging from our study is clear. There is a profound array of various climate emotions, and children and youth need true adult support to help them to channel the much needed energy in these emotions to constructive means. That's my 5 minutes. I say kiitos, thank you in Finnish. Here is my contact information, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Panu. We'll now hear from Dr. Charles Gumble, who's an assistant professor in applied psychology at the University of Nottingham in the UK. His research addresses how personal experiences, information exposure, and social influence shape the way people engage with environmental issues. He can't join us in real time as he's speaking at 2 other events today, but has kindly sent us a pre-recorded comment. And please bear with me while I set that up.
Hi, I'm Charles Gumble. I'm an assistant professor in psychology at the University of Nottingham. I'm sorry not to be able to join you today in real time, but I'm really grateful to Planetary for inviting me to comment on this important work, and also to the organizers of the webinar for permitting me to share a pre-recorded message. One of the most powerful things about the concept of climate anxiety is the way it's enabled us to articulate the varying degrees and types of emotional hurts that people around the world are experiencing in response to the global ecological crisis. As you know, climate anxiety has attracted a considerable amount of public interest over the last few years. But to my mind, there's been an important shortfall in our academic understanding of the nature and significance of the phenomenon. Our evidence base was largely limited to the Western countries of the global North. And considering that most countries of the global South are much less insulated from climate change, the lack of meaningful action by world leaders on global warming and greenhouse gas emissions is that much more alarming for people in the global South. As the results in this international study by Caroline Akron and colleagues show, young people growing up in the world today are rightly frightened by what the future holds. And this isn't just a first world problem. If you live in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and parts of Asia, you'd have been witnessing the brutal impacts of anthropogenic climate change firsthand for quite a while now. as was most recently demonstrated by the Canadian heat waves of 2021 and also the recent flooding in Germany. The global north and people in the global north are not completely shielded from these experiences either. Young people everywhere are keenly aware of the havoc that climate change is wreaking around the world. And the climate anxiety they feel is fueled by consciousness of how much worse things are likely to get if we don't urgently act to stem this crisis. So I agree with colleagues who go to great lengths to emphasize that climate anxiety is a completely rational and healthy response to truly understanding the magnitude of the threat posed by climate change. And I also understand that climate anxiety, by and large, motivates people to respond to climate change in constructive ways, like engaging in collective and individual pro-environmental actions. But I don't think the wider world adequately appreciates the strain that climate anxiety places on people's mental health and well-being. And this is especially relevant to young people. So organized action by young people in the last few years have helped to place climate change firmly on the international political agenda in a way that action by adults previously couldn't manage. And I also believe going forward that pressure from young people will help drive through the social and economic transformations that we urgently need to robustly address the threat posed by climate change. I propose that the best way we can help young people succeed in their mission to save our common future is by supporting them in ways that simultaneously sustain their momentum for action and protect their mental health. So this fight for a fair, safe, sustainable future is going to be a long campaign, and a lot of our young activists are already being run ragged. Now, the findings from Caroline Hickman and colleagues' study show that climate anxiety is negatively impacting the psychological functioning of our young people. And this is in line with findings from research I've been involved in with other colleagues, where we found that climate anxiety is taking a toll on people's mental health around the world. In particular, our research found that negative emotional responses to climate change are consistently linked to insomnia symptoms and poor mental health across both the global north and south. And more importantly, in an ongoing extension of this work, we're finding that while the link between climate anxiety and climate action is contingent on people's country of residence, climate change anxiety is significantly linked with poor mental health and well-being in every single country that we've drawn samples from. Now, a commonly preferred recommendation is that people should channel their climate anxiety into action. But if we think about it, it's not difficult to see that climate anxiety might not equally translate to action in different contexts. So many people in the global south lack opportunity or means to act environmentally. They have insufficient knowledge, they face political barriers, and so on. The hegemonic, colonial, and capitalist structures that dispossess our youth of their natural heritage and endanger their future also acts to barricade them from taking control of their destiny. Yet, these factors do not exempt our youth from suffering the adverse well-being impacts of climate distress. So as a result, I'm in solidarity with Mitzi Tan, the young Filipino activist who argued that justice must be at the heart of efforts to address young people's growing climate anxiety. I invite climate psychologists to more critically engage the inequities in the global burden of climate trauma and distress. When scientists and world leaders assemble at COP26 in a couple of weeks, justice needs to be an important metric by which we define acceptable solutions to this climate crisis. Wherever we come together, psychologists, as educators, as parents, as researchers, activists in any capacity to support young people navigating climate anxiety and the climate crisis, our efforts need to be in service of justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. May I next introduce Dr. Jade Sasser. She's an Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of California, Riverside. Her research and teaching explore how climate change intersects with gender-based activism reproductive justice, and women's health. Her current research explores how young people of diverse racial backgrounds experience climate emotions differently in the US. She further explores the impacts of climate anxiety on young people's desires to have children in the future.
Thank you so much. And greetings, everyone, and good morning from Los Angeles, California. And a special thank you to the organizers for including me in this important conversation. So I am a researcher whose work focuses on reproduction, specifically all of the things that enable people to freely decide to have children, or on the other hand, the things that limit that decision-making. What I have found in my own work is that having children represents a particular belief about the future, that the future is worth living in, that it is a place where you can create and leave a legacy that will survive long after you have left this world. In order to feel good about having children, it is generally important to believe that they will have a life that is better than your own, or at the very least, equally as good. This is why it is particularly important to pay attention to the aspect of the study wherein 39% of young people responded that they are hesitant to have children. This is a direct reflection of other results found in the study, particularly the 75% of respondents who said that the future is frightening, the 56% who said that humanity is doomed, and the fact that only 33% of young people who were surveyed believe that their governments are protecting them, the planet, and future generations. I have found similar results in my own work. This past year, I conducted a nationwide survey here in the United States that looked at 2,500 young people. The survey was focused on climate emotions and specifically the desire to have children. In my study, I found that for those who already have a child or who are pregnant, 60% report that climate change impacts how they feel about being a parent, and that the majority feel either more uncertain about parenthood or feel negative emotions about being a parent in the midst of climate change. Of those who did not have children and did not want them, 1 in 3 cited climate change and other environmental problems as the main reason. I also want to highlight another important focus area in my research. I'm interested in how social inequality, specifically racial inequality, affects climate anxiety and the desire to become a parent. Of those in my study who did not have children and who did not want them, 20% indicated that it was primarily because they feared racism and racial violence. This is an interesting finding on its own, but it cannot be separated from broader concerns about climate change. I've done qualitative research focused on in-depth interviews, and I would like to share with you just a few quotes from that research here. The first quote is from a young woman who identified as a Black American and was 23 years old. She said, "The world is just awful, and I don't want to bring anyone into it. Climate change is occurring, but also it's like the crushing racism and anti-Blackness of this world. It's just, yeah, I don't want to do it. I love kids, but I just can't." Another respondent, also a Black woman, said, "I'm undecided about children. We're totally dependent on the things that are driving climate change, so it's going to leave a disastrous problem for our kids to clean up. But the racial politics in this country make me deathly afraid to have a child, even more so than climate change. Because if everyone is burning up, the government will do something about it. But we have a long history of people ignoring the problems that hurt people of color the most. So although the climate impacts are worse in our communities, I don't think we'll get an equal share of the resources that we need to survive." A third young woman in the study, a 22-year-old immigrant from Guatemala, was also undecided about children. She said, "One day it's cold and the next it's hot. It's super dry and there's no water and it's scary. Like this is the time when fires are going to start and I don't know what to expect anymore. And then on top of that, we're dealing with racism and all of these other issues. If I had a child, would they have to endure that too? Would I also have to teach them, oh, when we're in public, you can't speak Spanish? Why can't my child just live?" So to close, I would like to recommend that we talk about the different vulnerabilities communities experience as they face climate change. The global study that we're discussing today found that the countries where youth expressed more worry about the climate tended to be poorer in the global south and more directly impacted by climate change. This is a very important insight. It is also important to take note of the social inequalities and vulnerabilities that exist within global north countries as well. Therefore, as we pay attention to the emotional and psychological impacts of climate change, and we think about the resources needed to respond to these impacts, let us also center the vulnerabilities and injustices that exist both within and between societies as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jade. And finally, in this section, please welcome Sally Weintraub, who will share her reflections on what we've heard so far and her thoughts on the concept of moral injury. Sally Weintraub is a practicing psychoanalyst and a fellow of the British Psychoanalytical Society. She has written and lectured widely on the climate crisis and on our relationship with nature, and is author of, amongst other works, the recent best-selling book, Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be asked to be part of this panel. It feels very important to me to be here, and thank you very much. I wanted to, we've all got 5 minutes and I can't possibly cover all the rich things that have been said. I do want to underscore, however, the central importance of the different vulnerabilities that different groups, and especially groups of colour, are facing with the deteriorating climate situation. So here goes, this is what I want to add as my reflections. We are hugely indebted to this group of researchers for this survey. It provides such vital, albeit truly shocking data. But more than that, I view administering this survey as itself an act of care. It said to young people, we care about what you think and feel about the climate emergency and environmental emergency. It provided a hug. It conveys that we will stand with you, we will represent you, and we will do what we can to change things. So many young people have been left alone with their scared feelings about climate, surrounded by a deafening silence. Many still can't speak openly about climate and honestly about how they feel to the people close to them and around them in their lives. With no one to talk to, many may not even let themselves know just how afraid and anxious, angry, exasperated, and let down they feel. Betrayed, in the words of the research. The survey shows us the imperative for all of us to talk with children and young people about climate, to ask questions, and more importantly, to listen and to make the full space for listening. In short, not to abandon them. I suggest what can get in the way of this engagement and makes it so very hard is that because things have got to this pass, it can feel unbearable to listen to what we're likely to be told. Our current economic model claims the lion's share for a few now, leaving nothing for the future. And I'll say that again, nothing for the future. Many children are staring with realism at this part of climate reality with growing understanding that they have been abandoned, left to suffer, with many indeed left to die. Moreover, they see that it is still largely socially taboo for them even to mention being in this position. It makes the adults and the politicians too uneasy, too guilty, and too disturbed. The researchers call putting children in this position, subjecting them to cruel and unusual treatment. And I fully agree. This level of neglect and lack of care is abuse amounting to torture. Mia Nelson, a young college student, entitled a poem that she wrote, "You Call It Eco-Trauma." It contains these lines. I call it waking up in the night in a cold sweat with my mother dying in the next room. The cold sweat is surely watching Earth's life support systems overloaded and gradually dying bit by bit. But it's also surely the dread that human care too will die, will be snuffed out like a candle. One of the children expressed this in saying, I don't want to live in a world that does not care about children and about animals. One aspect of torture is playing with people's hopes and fears. Will COP26 deliver the needed change, or won't it? COP26 is already being written off by those with experience and political acumen. And yet, we still hope, and the children hope. Our hope also daily fed by being lulled with clever lies. The children are being played with. It's a cat and mouse game, and it's sadistic, even if that is revealed to be indifference. The children are tasked with the huge, sometimes overwhelming work of not becoming cynical. Turning to cynicism can protect against the pain of being continually buoyed up only to be let down. To keep the candle of care alive in themselves, they are left to battle internally with managing their hope and despair. And that's cruel and unusual treatment. They are tasked with being continually flooded with confusing messages and filled with doubt about what is real and trustable. And that is cruel and unusual treatment. We see Greta Thunberg's hesitations over whether to meet with Biden, who, let us not forget, has just sanctioned Pipeline 3. What a cat and mouse game governments of the world are playing with the children. What a burdensome task we give them just to remain being human and caring themselves. Leave to them the difficult work of managing their hearts. Leave them in a cold sweat, realizing just how crazy collective leadership currently is. A collective leadership still enamored by the ideology of those like Ayn Rand, who promoted self-idealization, sanctioned self-interest, and the virtue of looking down on the little people. Turns out the little people include the children of the world. And yet, when inside the climate bubble, one promoted by a culture of uncare, all this is not seen, or rather, it is seen, but it's pushed to the edges of the mental stage, helped on by group pressure to stay stuck in disavowal and never to reach grieving how bad things have become. Those inside the bubble would be staggered and affronted to think that they are being cruel to the children, including their own children. Indeed, bubble logic has it that nothing is too good for their own children. They idealize them, not realizing that the idealization suits the current economic model. It boosts spending. The culture of uncare that liberated rampant greed in our era has led to widespread mental deregulation from care, from a perspective, and from responsibility. And this was its intention. The culture of uncare has deliberately sought to mess with our moral sense. The tragedy of our times is one of a gigantic collective moral failure. And I suggest we can't even begin to think about this in proportion, accepting what we are and are not responsible for, without an overall framework of care. A crucial part of that framework of care would be a law of ecocide. It would recognize environmental damage, and it would plainly say that while many, particularly in the global north, bear some responsibility for climate damage, the carbon majors bear the brunt of the responsibility. Having the perspective that comes with a law of ecocide itself would help people and young people manage their feelings about those that contributed to climate damage. Last paragraph. Emerging from the climate bubble inevitably leads to moral injury. It's a good thing if managed and supported by caring social groups, because it means our conscience is alive. It means we recognize both that we've been acted upon and we recognize we've played a part in things. And that recognition means that we are better able to place trust in ourselves, and that in turn will help us know what and whom to trust in the world. Because a key feature of moral injury is the loss of trust in leaders. And I go back to this wonderful research which found just that. A key finding is the lack of trust in current leadership. This is what the research is telling us. And this for sure is shocking, but it's also a sign that care is not just flickering, it is burning much brighter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally, and all the speakers from the first section. There's so much to get through today, and we want to start part 2 at about 2:45. So we've only got time for a few questions, and there's been so many coming in. So I think at least that shows there's appetite for more events like this, and apologies that we won't be able to cover more. Firstly, a question that's directed at Susan and Panu. So I don't know whom of you would like to answer. I'm curious about the emphasis on the importance of adult support for the youth experiencing climate anxiety grief. Is there not value in youth supporting youth through their shared experiences?
Yeah, I can provide a brief answer, which is all we have time for. I think that our goal today was really to, we're assuming we're mostly speaking to adults, and I think we're prompted by a feeling, as Sally was just saying, that we have failed in our responsibilities. So we're focusing on the responsibilities of the adults. Absolutely, there's very much value in youth supporting youth. I think that that feeling of collective struggle, collective belonging is not only a very positive experience, but a good source of resilience. But we didn't want to, I think in today's presentation, put any more obligations on the shoulders of the young people.
Thank you. Panu, do you want to add to that, or shall I move on with the next? Thank you. A question for Jade, please. Jade highlighted the fact that many young people are fearful for the future and considered not having children of their own. I'd be interested to know how those fears for the future expressed by young people and the percentage of young people considering not having children in the future compares to previous surveys asking young people whether they are fearful for the future and contemplating not having children. It's hard to make sense of recent survey research without knowing how it compares to previous similar research. Yeah, over to you, Jade. Thank you.
That's a really good question. These kinds of surveys are done periodically in different places around the world. There hasn't been a single global scale survey before that has surveyed 10,000 young people. And as a single event, climate change is far more likely than any other single event that has been studied in terms of reproductive intentions to have this kind of impact on young people expressing a desire to not have children in the future. I do want to say that, as was mentioned earlier, simply because young people say that they are hesitant or that they might not want to have children, that doesn't mean that they won't have them. But it's important to note that this marker of something that is for many people a very important life stage and a symbol of how they feel about the future, climate change is radically impacting how young people feel about it.
Thank you. And a question for Sally. We've got a couple of minutes, Sally. I'm so sorry to restrict you. So a question for Mrs. Weintraub. I would like to know if in her approach she considers that there's a difference in the contribution that psychology as a science and psychoanalysis as a discipline can make. Thanks again, it's been a wonderful space for me.
I think there's room for all approaches at this stage, and we all need to work together. I speak with a background and training in psychoanalysis, and for me the advantage of that is that I think it helps you to dig a bit more deeper into what might be underlying some of these anxieties and what might actually, what about them might not even have reached consciousness, which is why I think even doing this survey perhaps enable people to put into words things that they hadn't necessarily even formulated to themselves. But I think I think we need a broad church at the moment, and this is not a time for emphasizing differences between approaches.
Thank you. So shall we move straight on into the second half of the webinar? And we'll start with a conversation between Britt and Catherine about climate anxiety in our younger generation, seeking support and building intergenerational trust. So Britt Ray, a co-author of the study, is a human and planetary health postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's also the author of Gen Dread, a newsletter about the psychological underpinnings and impacts of the climate crisis. Catherine Langford is an Australian actress who you may have seen in widely celebrated productions such as Knives Out, Netflix 13 Reasons Why, and Cursed. She is also a mental health advocate. Over to you both.
Hello, Catherine. Can you see me and hear me?
I can't. Nice to see you again. Thank you so much for
Nice to see
having
you
me.
again. Oh, absolutely. Thank you for joining us today. It's an honor to hear your ideas on this topic because you've engaged quite heavily with the concept of young people's mental health, both on screen and off screen. First in starring, for example, in 13 Reasons Why, which deals with the topic of suicide, but also in your work as a mental health advocate. And you have fans from all over the world, really, who message you regularly to share their stories of struggles with mental health issues. And I'm really curious to know what you've been noticing about what these young people say as it relates to mental health intersecting with the climate crisis and how they're thinking and feeling about it.
Well, it's an interesting position because, like you said, with my work creatively, being a part of certain projects, but also working with organizations like Crisis Text Line and Trevor Project that deal with mental ill health and equality, I've been able to hear from different people, but also especially on social media, it's given me this really unique perspective where I'm hearing really personal details from people who live in parts and places from all over the world. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about climate anxiety and why I think it's so important to be talking about it is because despite people living in different parts all over the world, I've been seeing and hearing these increasing comments and sentiments towards climate inaction. Feelings like hopelessness and abandonment, but also feeling powerless, like they can't do anything or that they don't have a future, really triggering thoughts and feelings that obviously have an impact on mental wellness and mental well-being. So I think that's something that's affected obviously everyone all over the world in regards to the same thing, climate inaction.
Yeah, and one thing that I suppose is similar about how we're interacting with young people is that because of my newsletter, I get a lot of folks writing me with their stories of fears about the climate crisis, ways that they're trying to cope, how it's affecting their relationships or ways of showing up in the world. And there are two trends that I notice again and again. One is that many young people feel as though it's very difficult to access spaces close to them where their feelings are validated. So they can easily be belittled by, for example, family who might say, oh, don't be so dramatic, look outside the window, the sky's not falling, you're fine. This is all you being especially emotional about something that isn't rational to feel that emotional about, which of course our study shows, and as all the speakers have been talking about, it's very rational, normal, natural response to a civilizational threat scenario to feel. And even though it's globally so prevalent, as we see in the findings, it can be difficult to find the safe spaces to have those experiences mirrored and validated, which is a key concern in terms of maintaining mental health for young people who are feeling this distress. And then secondly, for those who take the next step of trying to seek mental health support through traditional avenues like therapy, for example, many people have recounted stories of going to see a therapist and then basically being told that they're engaging in catastrophic thinking. It's treated as a pathology, as like a general anxiety disorder, as though it can be just, treated clinically, perhaps with some kind of typical intervention or a pill even. And then that leaves people going home feeling many times worse, of course, and deeply misunderstood, alienated, and isolated. And so I just want to mention that it's very important then to know that there is climate aware therapy. There's a specific faction of emerging mental health support specifically designed with this understanding of the climate trauma lens. And the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliances, for example, have created a directory where people can find that specific form of suitable mental health support that will not gaslight, but will acknowledge and empower people who are having these distressing thoughts and feelings. Now, Catherine, you're Australian, and Australia is a very interesting country to look at in the context of the climate crisis because, of course, there's a lot of bushfires that happen there that are made worse by climate change. And also the country's track record, politically speaking, is not good on climate action and deep ties to the coal industry and all the rest of it. So I'm curious, has your Australian background affected your relationship to climate anxiety in some way? And if so, how?
Well, I grew up with a really strong attachment to the natural environment and natural assets. I come from a state called Western Australia, and we have the only global biodiversity hotspot in Australia, which essentially puts us on the same map as the Himalayas and the Appalachians. So where I'm from, there's a real appreciation for our natural assets, but I think also a belief that, we rely on our natural assets fundamentally, not only as part of our identity, but as part of our future. And you mentioned bushfires. We have bushfires every year. It's part of our environment, but the 2019 bushfires were really devastating. People lost their lives, people lost their homes, but we also lost, I think, close to 1 billion or 500 million wildlife, and we're still recovering from it. And my grandmother, who grew up in the Blue Mountains, she's in her 80s and she's seen bushfires every year, but she just has never seen anything like the climate change or those kind of severe changes that she saw in 2019. And I think actually at that moment during those bushfires, it was a really important moment, and it marked an important moment for Australia and also Australians, because we took a moment to actually look at what's happening in the world to where you're seeing things like this. So I think it really marked a sort of a conversation starter, or more of an awareness around the climate crisis for us. Yeah.
And the study that we're here discussing today has, as mentioned, come up with some striking findings, including, that 8 out of 10 young people of the 10,000 respondents from 10 countries across the global north and south think that the future is frightening. Over half think that humanity is doomed, or at least endorse that statement. And roughly 4 out of 10 report that they're hesitant to have kids. And I'm just wondering, given, that you're situated within that general age group of the people that we surveyed, what your first reactions were to these findings when you heard them?
I mean, it's disheartening, isn't it? It's disheartening. It's also, I guess, a tough thing to answer or address in a way, because people, depending on where they are in the world, different countries are experiencing the climate crisis in different ways, and governments are going to have to focus on, different things specifically or individually and address those individually. But it's interesting you mentioned, that generational thing, and I think in the research also, or in the findings, mentioning that more and more people are considering not having children, not starting families. I think that's interesting because, like you said, I'm the baby of millennials, and I'm the big sister to Gen Z. So I fit right in that gap. And it's been really interesting to hear from people, not just in my age group, but across all generations, the realization that we've had collectively that the way that we lifestyle that we have, it's fundamentally unsustainable. We're not able to continue going on the way that we have been and polluting and, doing the things that we have been. We really need to work together. And I think now more than ever, find common ground, find unity with one another to move forward so that we all have a future, because there's no such thing as a future for one if there isn't a future for all of us.
Absolutely. And closely tied to that is the sense that in the study, it was picked up very clearly that many young people feel betrayed and lied to by leaders who are, saying that they're doing their job to protect young people's well-being through climate action, but really it's that they're pretending to and not. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how this form of broken trust might be repaired, what healing could look like between and across generations, especially when it feels often like it goes beyond the mistrust of leaders to also just a general mistrust of adults at some point, when we're looking at the distress that young people are describing in terms of how they're feeling given the climate crisis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we talk about the future, right? Like there's no future for what, that we talk about the future a lot, but I actually think that the important thing to remember is the future is now. The future is not a later problem. It's not a problem for young people to deal with later. The future is now. It's a problem to deal with now. And it's something that's going to be affecting everyone. It's something that affects us all. It's tough to say what exactly would help specifically, but again, I go back to community. I think now more than ever, it's really important to be nurturing our communities, to be nurturing a sense of a global community, not just intergenerational, but also having our leaders, our global leaders, find community and work together on this, because this is something that affects us all.
Well, thank you so much for, generating community, doing your advocacy, using your platform to shine a light on these issues. We're all really grateful for that. And for you being here today. We should wrap up just because of time, but very nice to have you here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me and for your amazing advocacy. Your Gen Dread newsletter is an awesome resource, and it's such a privilege to hear from everyone today. It's such an important study, so I'm very happy and glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. We're pleased to welcome now Blanche Burley, who's dialing in at her midnight. So thank you very much for her reflections on the study and about how climate anxiety can be seen as an issue of injustice. So Dr. Blanche Burley is a climate change researcher and works at the intersections between climate change, gender, culture, education, justice, emotions, and the more than human world. She is author of the recently published book, Learning to Live with Climate Change.
Thanks so much, Katrina. And yeah, just echoing Sally's comments earlier, I feel really grateful and privileged to be part of this conversation. So thanks so much for having me. My name's Blanche. I'm a climate change educator. And as a researcher, my work is mainly situated between the disciplines of geography, feminist theory, and environmental politics. So coming from a slightly different approach to some of the other fantastic researchers here. Before I get going, I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the stolen and unceded country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging, and to acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. In my work, I've discussed climate anxiety as the sense that your world is ending, but Indigenous peoples all around the world remind us that colonialism has been ending worlds for many centuries. And I want to acknowledge that acknowledging this can help us situate contemporary experiences of climate anxiety of people all around the world in the longer histories of climate injustice and ecological distress. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation because this particular study is really important in terms of the research that we have so far on climate anxiety. That's because it shows us that climate anxiety is a really significant and pervasive issue for young people, but also it shows us that it's not just an experience of relatively privileged young people in the developed world, and that indeed it's more pronounced for those in the global south. This is research that we didn't really have access to before. In addition to the study's important focus on young people's perceptions, in addition, the study's it's really early here. In addition to the study's important focus on young people's perception of government inaction, this study therefore shows that climate anxiety is an issue of intergenerational and intra-generational injustice. This is really politically important. So as Britt and Catherine mentioned, in Australia, we frequently have conservative politicians and their like allege that climate educators and activists are creating, in our Prime Minister Scott Morrison's words, needless anxiety in young people. This study helps us demonstrate that it is in fact governments and their climate denial and climate delay which are creating these harms for young people. Nevertheless, while this study shows high levels of distress in the global south, it also shows that we need a lot more, both quantitative and qualitative research, exploring how this phenomenon is experienced differently by different people. So, for example, how it intersects with other forms of marginalisation, such as poverty and systemic racism, and how it plays out in specific elements of life, such as making decisions about jobs and livelihoods, or family relations, which both Jade and Charles have touched on already. So our responses to climate anxiety as a society globally and as, specific people in the world need to be tailored to the specific everyday and also long-term experiences of people. And research can help us do that better. In terms of where research could and should go next, I'm keen to see more interdisciplinary studies. So for example, in this study, the bringing together of psychology and also human rights law is a real strength of the study, and framing climate anxiety as a form of torture and moral injury was something that I hadn't considered before, and I think is really powerful. We also need to include cultural and arts-based research around what works to support people and enable them to imagine and enact more promising futures. In addition, we need political sciences, justice theorists, and social movement studies to be exploring the role that such emotions play in people's, especially young people's, politicization and their sense of agency and how they participate in politics. Taking this further, we need to consider the long-term sociological changes that are happening. So for example, after this study was published, Margaret Klein-Salomon commented on Twitter, "Wow, these are revolutionary conditions." And I think this is an astute point. Such pervasive existential distress will have profound social implications, and I agree will be revolutionary in some way. So I guess the question is that I'm taking away from this: what kind of revolution will this be, or could it be? I sense it as a grassroots cultural revolution that is involving reimagining and recreating what it is to be human and what it is to be in the world. At best, this could involve reimagining and regenerating interpersonal and multi-species relationships. But of course, these emotional experiences can also lead not only to mental harm, but also paralysation, resignation, or even authoritarian responses that seek to regain control. So there's an urgent need for more research and practical experimentation in everyday life, exploring how to help people sit with their ecological distress and channel it towards constructive responses. That's a task that many people can engage in, both psychologists and, as was mentioned in the chat, educators, but also people in their everyday life as well. This fantastic study will, I hope, amplify and re-energize those efforts. So my huge congratulations and thanks to the authors of it. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Blanche. So we're heading towards the end of the event. We've just got 3 more speakers to hear from, and I'm really hoping that we're going to have some time for questions. I think there's been a couple of comments that the recording will be available afterwards. And yes, I believe all attendees will be sent a link. So we're going to move on to hear from Eric and Lisa, two of the co-authors of the study, who are going to talk to you from a mental health practitioner perspective. Dr. Eric Lewandowski is a clinical psychologist practicing in New York State and is clinical associate professor in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NYU Langone Health. His clinical focus has been on problems of mood and anxiety in teens, and he has prior experience and training in mental health service research, global mental health, and epidemiology. He'll describe aspects of his professional transition into climate work, and then he'll hand over to Dr. Lisa Van Susteren, who is a general and forensic psychiatrist and frequent contributor on television, radio, and in the print media. In addition to community organizing, Lisa is the author of numerous publications, including Emotional Inflammation, Discover Your Triggers and Reclaim Your Equilibrium During Anxious Times, and is the co-founder of Climate Psychiatry Alliance. Lisa is the expert witness on the psychological damages to young people from climate disruption in the legal case Juliana versus US. And in 2006, she sought the Democratic nomination to the US state from Maryland. The title of her talk is "We Have the Data, What Can We Do?" Over to you both.
Thank you, Katrina, and hello, everybody. I'm very honored to have the chance to speak today and to be a part of this group. We have targeted today's event at an academic audience, and as a clinician with a research background, I fit the description of someone who might be in the audience. Among our group, I'm also the newest to the climate field, and we thought that speaking about my process of coming to this work would be helpful to others who wish to do the same. I'm a clinical psychologist affiliated with NYU Medical Center in New York City. Until this July, I was a full-time clinician in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. I've kept my involvement in clinical training at NYU and continue to support a teen depression program that I founded several years ago, but I've moved my clinical practice outside of the medical center to have more time to devote to climate work. I have experience in mental health services research and quantitative and qualitative research methods. Before training as a clinical psychologist, I completed a master's degree in epidemiology. I'm now 44 years old, and I have two daughters, age 4 and 5. They will be in their mid-20s by 2040 and their mid-30s by 2050. I'm privileged to have grown up in a part of Canada and now live in a part of the US that has not yet felt intense effects of climate change. The decisive moment for me was the release of the UN IPCC report in October 2018, which drew my own climate anxiety from the background to the forefront. At the time, I could see nothing to do with the feelings of anger, fear, sadness, and grief that would serve any meaningful purpose. Ranting to colleagues did not elicit a reciprocal response. It was a conversation killer among friends, so I didn't talk about it. A month earlier, I had had major orthopedic surgery, was occupied with 1- and 2-year-old children, and continued to have a demanding clinical job. By the new year, I was consumed again by the demands of daily life. The 2019 IPCC report again triggered a response of sadness, anxiety, and pangs of grief and anger. And I resolved then that whatever the climate future held, I would be a full participant. My first step was to email Lisa Van Susteren, whose work was mentioned in an email blast I received. And 2 years later, I'm here speaking with her today. What has guided me so far in this process is a need to answer the fundamental question, what can I do about the climate crisis? Someone such as myself, with my particular set of skills and inclinations, where does my shoulder fit? I don't have a full answer to this question yet, but I have learned that with my clinical and research foundation, I'm able to make a contribution. A contribution to this survey represents one aspect of a fundamental shift in my identity. When I made the commitment to become engaged, it was as an individual, not as a professional. And in this sense, it seems strange to talk about this as work. Rather, it is a redefinition of my purpose as a person, with climate change now at the center and the other necessary parts organized around it. This evolution has many expressions, including the application of my clinical and research training to contribute to a survey like this, decisions I make within my home and in how I raise my children, what organizations I support, what role I seek within my community, and where I now support a youth engagement effort at a local climate nonprofit. It includes political engagement, as I now work with my elected representatives to escalate climate policies in their agenda. I did not have the expectation that my most important role in the climate movement would be as a mental health professional, and I do not feel constrained to work only in the domain of mental health. Rather, I find that my training and experience are serving my efforts in all of these areas. From here, I hope to continue to translate my skills in support of climate activism. I also recognize that as the crisis evolves, so will the best use of my skills. Climate anxiety has not yet been a focal point of my clinical work. In fact, my recognition of climate anxiety in young people was one of the precipitants of my career transition. These concerns did not call for a clinical intervention designed to reassure or remediate. They called for a human response of validation and empathy, for joining and for action. I thought the best response to this distress led out of my office and into the ranks of the climate movement. My increasing involvement in this work has not eradicated my own anxiety, but has helped to bear the feelings and manage them constructively. I know I'm not weak or mentally ill. I'm paying attention and have empathy. I see the accelerating destruction and I fear for my children. I grieve for those who are directly affected already, for what has been lost and what will be lost. My clinical training affirms that this is a natural response when something we love and depend on is threatened or destroyed. I find respite and satisfaction in the knowledge that our group has provided something of value to the climate effort. Also in this group of colleagues and among people of all ages I have encountered through this work, I have found a sense of kinship and solidarity rooted in shared feelings and recognition of the crisis and its consequences. It shows me that I'm not alone, that there is an army and I have joined it. I'm sure all of you in the audience have different combinations of skills, backgrounds, and inclinations, and the best translation of those skills will be different for each of you. If there's anything I can suggest from my own experience, it's that despite one's newness to an area, it is possible to be helpful anyway. Rely on your training and maintain your discipline. Use the very same skills and qualities that led you to your current position and begin your search again. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Lisa, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Ah, great.
Have you lost video?
We can't see you.
Huh. I've pressed start video.
Oh. Well, maybe we'll just have to hear your voice.
All right. So why don't I plunge ahead? Maybe, here we go. The host has asked you to start your video. There we go. Well, I thought I was going to spare you. Hello, everyone. You cannot imagine, as I address people in this audience, how much your being here means to us. I'm sure you heard some of the pathos in Eric's voice, and maybe you'll hear it in mine too. So we know our kids are suffering, and now we have numbers to wave in the air for those for whom it didn't register that young people would be upset that their house was burning down. In our work, we build on those who have been warning since Svante Arrhenius first talked about greenhouse gases over 100 years ago. We build on the testimony of climate scientist Dr. James Hansen, who reported to the US Congress in 1988. And indeed, we build on the admissions of Exxon geologists who in the early 1970s warned that climate change, and specifically the greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels, could take us down. Here we are, without effective policies, and indeed witnessing government leaders still promoting and subsidizing burning fossil fuels. We have the data. We know we are in trouble. What is our special role? We have a unique one. Making the case for what climate disruption is doing to children is as persuasive an argument as we shall ever see. It is the moral ground that by rights should yield to no one and to no thing. We have the data. We have the statements, declarations, pleas, and protests. Young people are flooding the streets to tell us they are angry, in despair, and afraid. We know what trauma can do to young people. We know that the impacts of trauma can not only be enduring, but they prime for future stress. Many children suffer from pre-traumatic stress, having the same symptoms as classic PTSD, but due to thoughts of future trauma, they can't get out of their minds. Deaths of despair are already on the rise. The kids know they are being abandoned. They know government leaders are betraying them. Is it worth analyzing the intergenerational injustice or intergenerational aggression that underlies this? Is it worth reminding lawmakers of how the World Health Organization defines child abuse, not only as physical and emotional abuse, but as the failure to provide an environment in which a child can thrive? Given the magnitude of the losses and that policies that assure future losses are being carried out with full awareness of the consequences, what choice do we have in asking? There is state-sponsored terrorism. Is this not state-sponsored child abuse? On this call, I imagine we are thought leaders, perhaps mainly mental health professionals. We have a big job, showing children that we care and collectively doing our part to change the course of history towards survival. Up until now, mental health professionals have largely left the power of their expertise on the table. No more, for we are uniquely qualified. We get urgency, we get science, we get life and death consequences, we get defenses and know how to burrow under them. We know how to persuade people to make changes in their lives before it is too late. We can inspire people with silver linings, even in the darkest of places. People trust us. We have the data. So speak up, even when your voice trembles. Capture the energy embedded in your anxiety, despair, and outrage, and redirect it into action. Press your professional organizations, clinics, academic centers to organize trainings and conferences, expand their curriculum. Press your colleagues, reach out to teachers and parents who need help talking with their kids. Go to your city or district community meetings and tell politicians and policymakers what climate disruption is doing to our children. And while you're at it, the children of other species. Tell them you are a member of a new class of conscientious protectors. Run for office yourself, but most of all, build your resilience. Find your climate buddies. The group you see here, we are tied emotionally, viscerally, and whether we think about it or not, we are an immense source of comfort to each other, and it is our collective voice that gives power. You need this solidarity too. If there isn't a group nearby or right for you, organize one. We will help you. And remember, in closing, if you wake up in the middle of the night worried, think of us and know we are with you, and we will keep working together even if we can't see each other. We don't know why, but we are here, and because of that, we are called to act. I'll leave you with this thought. In a single hour, enough solar energy reaches Earth to meet our needs for a year. Wind, it blows at 40 times what we need. We can do this, but we have to be smart, we have to be together, and we have to do it now. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I'll try and focus on the facilitation and not get emotional myself. We've got a really quick time now for some questions. Thank you so much for engaging in this as attendees. We've had so many questions coming in and we're not able to do justice to all of them as we just don't have enough time. But we will as a group find a way of collating everything that's come in and responding to them in some way. So there's a question for Catherine. It's heartening to see you using your platform for climate advocacy. The questioner is wondering how you feel about others in similar positions, for example, visible actors, artists, who may perpetuate unsustainable habits, and how you reconcile those feelings.
Hello, hi. To answer that question, thank you very much. I think it's important for all of us to kind of do our part, and if it aligns with your morals, to kind of pursue that. I've spoken to a lot of other friends, musicians, artists, actors. I know that not everyone feels empowered on social media, but I'm hoping that we can find communities, more communities, to create spaces and find places that really highlight those ideals, and doing things like this, highlighting amazing studies like this with experts, you know, with researchers who are taking the time to really make a difference in this space and help raise awareness.
Thank you, and for the work you do. The next question, it might be that all of the speakers who we've heard from in this section would want to comment, and it's come up a few times, been worded slightly differently. But it's basically, so one questioner says, I'm interested in the panelists' thoughts on the messaging we give young people about climate action and responsibility. I'm remembering Greta Thunberg's response to learning about climate change at age 8 and then being told that if she recycled paper in school, everything would be okay. So I think a lot of climate crisis focused resources for children still advocate this kind of behaviour related action. And is this in fact putting the burden back onto youth, be the generation to solve the climate crisis and be active in the movement to address your anxiety? Maybe we could hear from one or two of you about the answer to that. Blanche, would you? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. I did type a response in the chat, so sorry for, or in the Q&A, so sorry, this will be repeating. It's a really important point, and yeah, I think particularly coming from environmental education, so much of what we are teaching young people in climate change education around the world is this really kind of, in terms of responses, is a really depoliticized, individualistic kind of response around behavior change. And we know that just 100 companies are responsible for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so although individual action is great, until we address those systemic multinational corporate interests, then we won't be able to address the problem fully. One of the challenges that I guess we discuss in environmental education is how young is too young to be asking, you know, kids to be engaging with the really dire situation. So I think my response to that is that we can teach even really young kids both to love nature, but also about how to practice building community, working together and enacting collective action on other collective action problems, so that when the time is right for them to engage with the really big issues of climate change, that they're sort of already versed in the practices of working together and are better able to step into that space rather than, you know, go into the individual behaviour change approach. So yeah, it's a really important issue. And there's some great research around calling out these petropedagogies and how they're pushed by the fossil fuel industry as well, by trying to redirect attention away from systemic change and try to make people think it's all about reducing their individual carbon footprint, but it's really disempowering.
Thank you, Blanche. That's a fantastic response. I think we better move on to wrap up the webinar. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Caroline Hickman, co-lead researcher and author of the study. Caroline is a psychotherapist and lecturer at the University of Bath and has been conducting qualitative research for 10 years into children and young people's emotional responses to climate change in the UK, Europe, Brazil, the Maldives, Nigeria, and the USA. She's been examining eco-distress, eco-empathy, trauma, moral injury, and the impact of climate anxiety on family relationships. A practicing psychotherapist and board member of the Climate Psychology Alliance, She has been part of developing a range of services for ecological distress. She delivers talks and workshops in climate psychology, emotional resilience, and mental health internationally. She works with schools, parent groups, climate scientists, and government departments to advise on the mental health impact of climate change and the psychosocial responses needed. So now Caroline's going to offer concluding comments and make links between the research launch in September, where we've reached today, and where next. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Katrina. And thank you, everybody, for joining us and everybody for speaking. I just want to bring in a few voices to begin with of some of the children and young people who've been communicating both through previous research of mine, qualitative research, and also in response to this research, as well as a few comments of my own. So these are quotes from children. I'm sad. My friends are dying. My friends, the fish, are all dying. Why don't people care? In Iceland, they had a funeral for a glacier. Who's going to have a funeral for our country? We're going to be underwater soon. If people would listen to us, to the children, then maybe our children will inherit a world in which they themselves can bear to bring their own children. I'm really delighted that there's so many people here joining us from all over the world. This is absolutely what we wanted. We launched this research a month ago, and so many people that I've spoken with in response to this say, isn't this depressing? Isn't this awful that children and young people feel this way? I've also delivered this research to many groups of young people over the last month, which is a bit daunting and very uncomfortable sitting there in front of groups of children and young people, giving them this message of humanity is doomed. And you know what? I've been watching people's faces, well, and also thinking, well, I'm not going to be asked back, because the adults' faces, I'm generalizing horribly and I apologize, but the adults' faces look at me with horror when I say these things. I feel pretty awful saying these things. And then we ask the children and the young people to put comments in the chat at the end of the webinar or at the end of the workshop. And then the comments start coming in saying, this research gives me hope. I feel hopeful. I feel relief that you're telling us this. Thank you. Thank you, because we feel that you care about us. So these young people are alive to care. And this is from Sally's book. And that aliveness and thinking about what we've trying to be talking about moral injury being a sign of mental health, not disorder. It means one's conscience is alive. There is no question, as we've heard today, that the climate crisis is one of unfairness, global injustice, and that children and young people are generally not defending against this in the way that many are, particularly governments. Moral injury occurs when command is casual about killing, casual about the deaths of many people all over the world. But we're not casual, and I think that's so much about what we're trying to communicate collectively here. And I know some people are really uncomfortable with the definition of climate anxiety, but in my experience, children and young people are claiming it for themselves as an empowering stance, as a way of communicating their distress and their frustration. So let's be clear, we do not want to cure or treat or fix or remove climate anxiety because it's healthy. But we do need to hear it, and we need to understand it, and we need to examine what it means. And we want to transform it, and we need to say sorry. But we need to transform it through activism, legal cases. 6 children and young people in Portugal currently suing 33 European governments and the European Court of Human Rights. They're telling us how they feel. They're showing us how they feel. We need to be supporting them. And we need to find ways towards reparation and humility and radical hope. And I want to just finish with I'm going to read you the first email that arrived. Emails started flooding in from children and young people all over the world after we launched this research a month ago. And I'm just going to read you one of them. I've asked her permission. She says, I'm only a single private person studying in Germany, but I feel the urge to thank you and your colleagues so much for the research and the study about climate anxiety amongst youth around the world. What the study reveals makes me, for the first time ever, feel that I am not alone with the future and climate anxiety that I experience every day. I still don't know what places there are to go in order to learn how to cope better with this anxiety, but I consider the recent study of this university and this group of researchers as an incredibly important step for us young people around the world to emotionally connect, and even visually realize that no one of us is alone with this huge issue. I profoundly hope that the message of your study reaches politicians around the world, as well as all socio-psychological professions, so that they can react to the needs of us young people. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Caroline, for your words and for all the work you do. So that's us. We've come to the end of the webinar. And before we finish, I'd like to say some thank yous to all the speakers today, my co-author colleagues and our fantastic guest speakers. Thank you. Thank you to Liz Marks and Eloise Mail. Liz is co-lead author with Caroline and Eloise co-author, who've both been busy in the background for this webinar and very much in the foreground for other work that's going on around the study. Thank you to Judith Anderson and Rachel Webster for tech and administrative support. And thank you to Avaz, the online campaigning organisation who funded the global survey. And thank you, finally, all of you for signing up and joining us in this conversation. Sorry we didn't get to answer all your questions, but I hope that means that we'll see you at our next event. Goodbye.